first? Okay, I'm pretty sure that means the recording is started. I call upon Prime Minister to open up the debate for the opening government. Here.
Um, cool. Am I visible and audible?
Crystal clear.
All right, fantastic. POIs in chat, please. Time starts on my next word. Actually, no, POIs, unmute yourself. I'm not looking at chat, sorry. Just interrupt me. Okay, cool. Time starts on my next word. 3 bits on framing. Firstly, I think there's a US interest in curbing Chinese influence in international markets, and given that solar panels are a major source of income and influence for China, especially in the developing world, there's a massive incentive for the US to try and curb that, given that they've had a shift to China over the last 14 years. Secondly, Trump's presidency specifically is interested in domestic autarky, and I think you can push solarization as a form of economic benefit rather than some environmentalist one. So Trump has majorly flip-flopped on like whether or not they're banning immigrants from Mexico and trying to take over Canada's 51st state. I don't think that he's committed to a specific stance at the point at which you can sell solarization as a way of generating employment or domestic autarky against, say, the control of oil by OPEC. I think he can push this as a stance to win on. But finally, it breaks the grip of oil producers, right? The U.S. is a net importer of energy and specifically oil, and I think OPEC right now has a lot of power in light of the oil glut that has happened post Russia Ukraine. Why is the U.S. able to do this? Because even with the Republican government in power, the states with the most amount of population, places like California, New York, and New Jersey, all have buyback schemes that have made it very popular to solarize your own domestic house, which is to say that the majority of people living in those states, which are the most populous states in the US, live in solarized conditions, and there's a massive amount of demand to engage in that buyback scheme to get, less energy costs in your domestic household. Secondly, California had a massive tech industry with large amounts of investment in solarization. Solyndra was the third largest solar producer in the world and the largest seed company in the US back in 2016. The reason they lost out was because of Chinese competition. But in a world in which Trump is willing to put tariffs and import controls on Chinese products, it means that these industries can be protected and grow again, i.e., the infrastructure to develop solarization is already there and the infrastructure to innovate and engage in R&D exists. Thirdly, electrification, right? So things like Tesla and the expansion of EV vehicles means that there's a demand for more and more recharging station electrification in general as you move away from oil-based vehicles, which means that there's a demand for things like solar to be able to produce electricity in faraway places that don't want to rely on oil lines. Finally, UN SDGs means that there's a massive push amongst international financial institutions, right? SDG 14 is entirely based around renewable energy, which means that this becomes an important way to attain financing from
Clarification.
IFIs for America itself, i.e., Trump might use this as a way to gain favor in the international community, but specifically gain access to things like funding and investment that America likely needs right now when they're trying not to spend as much money. Why is this good for America and the world? Firstly, I think there's rising energy costs and trade balance issues. This is to say that US is a net importer and it requires more energy than it exports, especially as Trump is looking to expand domestic industry. Even expanding fracking and oil refining requires initial energy input. The way you meet that energy input is not by importing more oil from places like OPEC, which are charging you higher and higher rates every day in response to sort of the US's interference in places like Gaza, but it's by solarizing and therefore reducing your reliance on international supply lines. Given that Trump has won on a platform of self-sufficiency and national autarky, I think solar is a means of achieving that. But secondly, things like employment generation, right? So when you try to solarize, you need things like engineers, you need things like procurement providers, you need things like supply line specialists who can lay down wires. These are types of jobs that can employ people from your just your regular miner who can lay down cables to someone who's sort of who's more educated and upper and like higher up in the skill level, which means that you gain massive amounts of employment benefits from all levels and all strata of American society. So there's a large amount of employment generation that can push back against the rising sort of cost of living issues that the US is facing. But the second argument is on the supply chain resilience and trade war. This is to say that China is likely to respond to America's increasing engagement in a trade war by tightening things like supply lines, specifically on things like polysilicon, semiconductors, and cylinders. All of the things that you require a domestic industry to counter that type of to counter that type of response. There's also a question of national security, right? If the U.S. is looking to expand energy supply lines, i.e., by looking to expand to places like Greenland, I think investing in solar is a unique way to expand away from the need to go out and look and take over places like Panama or Greenland, which means that you increase your national security too. Before I go on, sure. Oh.
Yeah, so to build solar panels, you need raw materials. Where are the raw materials?
Sure, there's massive amounts of investment. The US has a massive investment in Congo, for instance. You can gain raw materials there. I think you were likely to import some raw materials, but importantly, raw materials are far less expensive than relying on oil itself, right? So, sure, there's an initial cost of importing more alkalis or more rare earth minerals initially, but once you build your solar industry, one that already kind of exists, I think you can offset those costs, but they'll always be cheaper than having to import and rely on oil from untrustworthy and unpredictable producers like OPEC or Russia or the EU. Secondly, or third argument, it weakens a major Chinese industry. Recognize that China uses solar as a way of winning political goals, i.e., for the last 10 years, China has refused to meet the nationally determined contributions set in the Paris Climate Accords to decarbonize. And the excuse it gives is that by distributing solar panels to the developing world, it offsets the carbon emissions of local Chinese industry, which just isn't true, right? China is a net polluter in the world and has refused to meet those determined contributions. It sort of politically uses this distribution of solar panels as a way of not meeting them. So this is to say that there's a benefit to the world globally, even if the US has an intent to help the world. But by sort of increasing domestic expansion of solar panels, you encounter a lot of Chinese industry, i.e., in a world in which you develop enough solar panels where you can export them to the world, which is something that Trump isn't against, right? It's a world in which you counter Chinese control over that market, and you gain more ability to criticize China for not meeting its own nationally determined contributions. But the monopolization of China in this market is also bad, right? Like the fluctuation of the renminbi often means that China uses access to solar panels as a way to gain more currency from developing nations that have less bargaining power against them. There's a lack of predictability. There's also questions of patent theft and technology theft. But finally, I think there's more competition in the world for solar panels is good for the world too, i.e., when you have more producers trying to compete with the same thing, prices go down and innovation and R&D also go down. Given that the US has a massive tech sector, which at least for most analysts is probably more advanced than China's could ever be, I think you just gain more innovation and R&D. But even if they're equal, more people innovating and trying to do research in the same industries just likely produces more benefits there, which means that if we care about long-term things like more, better environmentalism and more renewable energy innovation, you get that through this. But secondly, I think a way to counter the cheapening of the sort of cheap cost of Chinese products, you have to create things like financing schemes, i.e., international financial institutions are likely to buy into these because they likely see US as a more reliable exporter than China and are probably willing to sort of offset the initial cost of importing US solar panels by offering things like financing schemes to developing nations. On all those grounds, because it's better for the world, because the US can achieve this, and because it's good for everyone, proud to propose.
I thank Prime Minister for their brilliant remarks and call upon Leader of Opposition to open up the off bench. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. I want to start by pointing out that this House believes that motion, therefore teams should be adjudicated on what is best for the world at large. Although OG tries to say that their policy is better for the world at large, most of their arguments center around boosting the US economy by pivoting from fossil fuel and weakening China. They have a point about competition. I'll explain why this doesn't work in my substantive. But firstly, some important pieces of context. In the status quo, China has a huge monopoly on solar panels internationally. This is because they have a monopoly over the extraction of minerals that are necessary to build these solar panels, nickel, lithium, cobalt, and copper, in both domestic and overseas mines in Africa. They have pre-existing partnerships and investments into places like Africa through greenfield FDI and through other means, etc. But secondly, they have increasingly built up decades of expertise through their R&D with lowered cost of production, and therefore now control about 90% of manufacturing of these solar cells in the first place. It is a ludicrous idea to suggest that America, by aggressively pursuing the development of their sector, will be able to outcompete China and somehow create variability and lower costs, which benefits everyone. We contest this premise vehemently. But firstly, I think it's the main point of the OO case will be showing why this is bad for developing economies that rely on their partnerships with China, specifically pertaining to solar cells. Firstly, why is China good for these developing countries? Firstly, China has geopolitical control by being the world's main or primary refiner of raw materials, which is to say, the global south are reliant on access to China's refinery lines through partnerships to gain profits through exporting, right? The counterfactual that happens on site government is that Trump does not have access to refineries and assembly lines in the present status quo because there has not been decades of investment in R&D into these sorts of things. There are two outcomes that flow from this. Firstly, they're likely going to have to outsource these refineries or these assembly products in the short term, which increases the costs that are transferred onto the people that mine the materials in the first place. But secondly, if they were likely to make their own or develop these assembly lines domestically, they're likely to be underdeveloped and simply not working to the same expediency or efficiency as Chinese assembly lines. This means that they produce or they refine less minerals per dollar, and this means that the cost or the brunt of this is likely transferred onto these developing countries and the mines that they house. But secondly, they don't have the know-how or technology. China has the technology that they give directly to these domestic mines to expedite and increase mining output. Chinese firms have patented technology and developed from decades of exclusive R&D into these sorts of technologies that can help mining countries actually extract more minerals per dollar. The counterfactual here on their side of the house is that Trump's pivot is too little too late. He's infinitely lagging behind. And if you don't believe this, I just want you to look at the Infoslide because it says that China currently controls 80% of solar cell energy production. The lagging behind or the disparate difference in their stages of development are extremely large, and this harms developing economies because when Trump is going to invest in his domestic market for solar cells, he's going to focus his resources on building domestic manufacturing plants and assembly lines in the US. He will have no financial bandwidth or no capacity to extend aid to the mining processes in Africa to help them expedite their processes. So the cost of all of these lack of technologies once you remove China from Africa is that they simply have no ability to extract to as large of an extent, and this means that their export profits go down, which tangibly hurts a lot of the lower working middle classes in these developing countries that are forced to work in mines. Understand that this is a contrast to the state of development of Chinese assembly lines, wherein the Chinese have so much money and capacity that they are actively giving them refinery tools and giving them tools to extract faster. This is the counterfactual that we're talking about, and these are individuals that are the most vulnerable and should be weighed the most heavily in this debate. But before I move on, I'll take a point. OG.
I'm finding it difficult to believe that just because the US expands domestic industry, that necessarily means that Congolese miners lose out. I think in a world in which Trump is willing to not compete with China to develop domestically, I don't understand why that means that China gets pushed out of the Congo.
Okay, so the reason why there's necessarily going to be a displacement or a pushing out is because America does not domestically produce these minerals and they have to import it from somewhere. And currently, China has invested $16 billion into overseas mines in 2023. They control half of the world's global nickel and lithium production, which means therefore that if America wants to aggressively pursue this policy and wants to be comparable to the state of development of this sector in China, they do need to take control of these overseas mines, and that necessarily entails going into the Congo, going into places like Africa, and therefore taking control of these overseas mines. So why is this bad for the developing world necessarily? What is Trump likely to do to aggressively pursue these mines? The first thing he's going to do is to threaten to impose tariffs. And this is something that we've seen to be true because his conceptions of placing tariffs onto China includes third-party states that partner or ally with China. Once he recognizes that these African states are getting a lot of their partnership and investment from China, he's going to be more willing to tariff them or threaten to tariff them if they do not dissolve their existing partnerships with China and pivot to him. But secondly, there's a withdrawal of developmental aid. He can use this as a carrot or a stick to say that I'm going to withdraw the aid that I'm giving you right now if you don't presently give me dissolve your current partnerships and partner with me instead to build the US domestic solar panel industry. Why is this bad? What is the harm on government? There are two scenarios that could possibly take place. The first is that developing countries takes Trump's deal because they are coerced into doing so. This is bad because they lose access to the advantages of China as a partner, their supply chains, the benefit of vertical integration that Chinese firms have that decrease the cost for these countries to mine and export in the first place. But secondly, developing countries stay with China, but they are forced to maybe become more covert with their allyship in China, perhaps export less to China. And this again falls into the same harm because China, they need to do this so that they can avoid the full brunt of US economic sanction that is threatened by Trump by saying that, hey, perhaps we'll decrease the extent of our partnership with China so that we don't get tariffed or get our developmental aid withdrawn. Again, this is bad. But so what is the through line of the opposition case? It is that this policy is not one rooted in bettering the state of renewable energy. It is one motivated by Trump's vendetta against China. And this leads to collateral damage incurred by third-party developing economies that are reliant and caught in the crossfire. This is bad because this policy is therefore regrettable insofar as it decreases these developing economies' ability to actually feed their mining workers and create a better standard of living for these individuals. I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech and call upon Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello, folks. Am I audible?
Visible and audible, yes.
Sounds good. Just give me a second.
No worries.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with running a case that relies on saying that the USA doesn't have the capability of producing a solar market is it ignores the requirement that the USA now faces economically and socially. Idea being that the USA is running short of oil and the global industry is running short of oil. Either ways, this means that either ways, the global industry has to make a move towards renewable energy as oil energy gets more and more expensive. The option the US faces in this are twofold. Number one, given that solar energy is the most popular form of renewable energy, we assume that everyone who goes towards renewable energy has to sort of start somewhere from here. We tell you then the US has two options. It is either to continue with the status quo, which is continue buying things exclusively from China, as opening opposition suggests, or develop their own solar energy sector. The problem with open opposition's case, first of all, it doesn't deal with all of the problems that Sarim has already highlighted, i.e. US's growing economic issues by running a trade deficit, by doing massive energy imports is a huge growing problem, not just for the US because it can no longer continue doing these trade balance issues, but it's also a problem for the global industry because the way the US gets around by doing much more imports than exports is by keeping things like interest rates extremely high, which means that global currency balance against dollars are being massively harmed. So we on the first level don't think that opening opposition's done a fair job of telling us how the world continues to function in their world. But number two, their big complaint seems to be that the USA cannot develop this for two reasons. One, their local industry is not strong enough, but two, more importantly, they say that China controls the raw material supply completely. I have a couple of responses to this. Number one, I think this is just factually untrue, right? So I don't think when the USA wants to stop China, they necessarily need to kick China out of Congo to have access to Congo. We think in the vast majority of cases, it is Chinese private companies, not the Chinese state, that has deals with many countries in Africa. It's usually not exclusive selling deals. It usually is a factor of whether or not the USA is interested in entering Congo in the first place or not, and less a factor of whether or not there's enough space for the USA to enter this market. Number two, there are alternative options. Like USA's main reason for trying to get Greenland right now is because Greenland has some of the world's biggest REM, rare earth mineral supply in their land. And sure, Trump isn't going to take over Greenland, but generally we think Trump's ability to get access to REM areas, including those in Greenland, is particularly high, given that he has a lot of military strength over countries like Europe, etc. B is very willing to exercise that military and political strength to get access to these REM things. Number three, we think you can make Chinese products more expensive. So you don't necessarily have to cut China off from domestic supply as much as you just have to make the eventual Chinese product expensive, because it's not like the USA just can't get silicon or nickel right now. We don't have enough of it. The problem is the USA has to pay more money to access these because they don't directly mine them themselves right now, and China controls the supply line. The issue then is that the Chinese solar products would be more expensive than Chinese products. This, however, gets solved in a world where the US is just extremely willing to tariff China, as it already is doing, especially over solar matters. An additional reason why we think this is so important is because the USA gets preferential market treatment, i.e. the most expensive markets from Europe prefer buying US products compared to Chinese products when both countries produce the same things. Why? Because the USA is able to off-cut any price difference by making Chinese products extremely expensive by imposing global tariffs that the EU or all other countries have to follow. Notice, China can do the trade war back, but Chinese tariffs on the USA aren't followed by anyone else. This means that the USA uniquely is going to be able to compete in this situation and get a lot of buyers for its things, which means that like opening opposition's biggest attack that the USA just literally can't do this, I don't think works. I also don't think it answers the normative question in this house believes that motion of whether or not the USA should do this. So I do think opening opposition is going to do some really unfair rebuttal after we can't respond to it. But then I'm going to push a couple of arguments forward because I think that like opening up hasn't done really a good job of refuting them. The idea that the USA needs to do this for competition goes to tackles directly their idea of like developing countries and workers' rights in those situations, because they assert two things. Number one, they assert that China currently runs extremely humane worker conditions in those countries. You have no reason to believe this given you run, especially given that it's private Chinese companies who are just as profit motivated as USA private companies are going to be, who are the limiting factor over here seems to be the laws in African countries as opposed to the ability of each individual to just do bad worker rights. We think if there's space for exploitation, you've given us no reason for why China wouldn't advantage of the same exploitation that US private companies do. But before I move on to this idea of why worker rights are going to be balanced, closing opposition, your extension?
Trade relationship between China and US are already in a very vulnerable stage. Pushing for domestic solar aggressively trigger Chinese economic retaliation. It hurts other industry further.
All right, this is actually a very good point because one, we tell you that China, even if it economically retaliates, it can't really hurt the USA because buy-in into Chinese sanctions or tariffs, etc., is extremely low compared to US ones. But the other point is actually pretty good, which is we don't want instability in this market. So how do you weigh instability that will be caused by USA coming in with competition, right? And that's sort of like the way up I'm going to do right now. The issue right now is that China can also cause as much instability as the USA could. What do we mean over here? In a world where China exclusively controls supply lines, in a world where China exclusively controls who it can provide these solar panels to, in the context that the entire world now has a global demand of solar items, China gets the exclusive ability to decide who gets and doesn't get this competitive advantage. This means that Chinese competition, so things like Taiwan, countries like India in Asia, or even countries in the Europe right now, can selectively face discrimination from China when it comes to China providing these things. We think China already does that. So China, for example, doesn't allow solar exports into India or doesn't allow Taiwan to benefit out of like Chinese solar markets. The issue over here, however, is that when China can give competitive advantages to just its allies and not to US allies, regionally, everywhere in the world, Chinese allies continue doing better than American allies do. This obviously makes it much more profitable for one to ally with China, and it makes it much more easier for China to do bullying of other countries. But in terms of worker rights, right, we tell you exclusively when more companies are able to jump in and competitively offer workers higher wages relative to each other, those workers get more options. Worker rights improve in a world where American companies are able to say we'll pay you $5 more than the Chinese company, or are held better in a world where Chinese companies are able to undercut American companies for any imperialism they do. The idea that you necessarily have to kick one out of like only one can operate in the market, we think is extremely untrue. Lastly, on competition, we think it makes like efficient, it makes R&D much quicker. So right now, when you just have Chinese companies with just Chinese science and research trying to develop this, is much slower when multiple companies trying to get one advantage over each other so that they can competitively sell to the market much more. You probably push each other more and develop much quicker. So proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their brilliant remarks, and I call upon Diallo. Here.
Hi, Justin, he, him, POS in chat. Obviously, the US can tariff China. We posit that it's not a good thing for the world for the US to tariff China because, as they say, the prices of solar energy and buying solar panels for the rest of the world are going to increase because the US currently cannot produce them nearly as cheaply in the next 5 to 10 years. Reiya gives you the structural reasons for this. I want to add the impact that China is broadly in the status quo a good enough actor for developing solar energy globally. They already want to innovate because they want to stay ahead of the curve, as it were. They want more solar energy domestically, which is good for the environment and for the economy, and they want to sell it overseas because they want to compete with the United States, which is an exporter of shale oil or LNG, which means the premise of their case is wrong. This is all extremely useful because it proves that the status quo is broadly good in terms of providing a sufficient runway towards the solar revolution, which is good for lesser developing countries. China has all the incentive in the world to use their profits to continually reinvest into mines in Africa, into developing better processes for developing this type of energy. But when they are forced to compete with the US in that sort of sense, the US is able to do things like dump their expensive and inefficient solar panels on the rest of the world, inhibiting that runway that we talked about in that first speech. This is fundamentally risky because they don't actually prove that they get their long-term benefits. It's fundamentally unstable because it's unclear that the US will aggressively pursue this for a long amount of time. Trump might very well get bored of this plan. The next president might quash it, but because you sacrifice all of that instability that Reiya talks about for an uncertain benefit, you should rely on the status quo where China is developing this solar energy and exporting it to the rest of the world. What did they say? They said the US might get Greenland's materials instead of Africa's materials, but the harm is still symmetric in that sense. They're going to pressure them in really terribly ungood ways to get materials because the US currently doesn't have those materials. Then they say, well, the private Chinese firms are not that good. But if you buy the fact of reality that the US is an exporter of oil and not an importer, China wants to compete in the energy market with the US. And the way they do that is by collecting raw materials from developing countries, refining them in China, and therefore being able to produce a lot of solar renewable energy that explains usefully why China needs the lesser developing countries as much as they need them. There is a stable business environment that already exists in the status quo. You should believe on weighing that China is decently good in the status quo and doesn't require that sort of competition. At best, OG therefore proves only that the US might benefit in the best case, but clearly the US is an unimportant actor insofar as it's the richest economy in the world. We explained that people are caught in the crossfire, but let's deal with them on their own metric. Even with respect to US citizens, it's generally not clear if the US wants to increase things like refining, increase things like mining in the US that are generally quite bad for costs and the environment. It's not good, right? It's not fucking good. Trump hates the environment. He revoked things like Biden's Green New Deal infrastructure. This is solely about China, and the logical intuition of our case is that when he wants to fuck with China, he fucks with all those countries that are aligned with China. The premise of the op then is not that the US sometimes has raw materials. It's that China has way more raw materials in the status quo, and the US wants to expand into this market. He necessarily has to take some of those raw materials away from the Chinese sphere of influence. And even if you don't buy this factually, just think in terms of how he thinks. He would like to take mines away from China as opposed to developing them somewhere else, because that's how he can stick it to Xi Jinping specifically. What therefore is the issue? The issue is that he's going to be, as a result of this kind of policy, increasingly angry at Chinese aligned countries. He will fuck them up. He will tariff them to hell. He will cancel their development aid. And as a result, these are countries which are at the very least forced to decrease their relationship with China, or alternatively pivot entirely to the US in terms of who they sell to, or in terms of who they buy solar panels for. Obviously, this is bad because US solar panels fucking suck, but more than that, Africa broadly needs China more than the United States. The West, like the EU or even the US, all don't care, or they're too busy fixing their own problems. China stepped into these sorts of industries or in these sorts of markets because they were closer and they were able to fill this gap. We explained usefully in Reiya, therefore, that China was broadly a better actor in this market for solar energy than everyone else in this debate. Firstly, because they had the technical know-how and the expertise to even invest in these lesser developing countries to begin with. This is certainly true for the next 5 to 10 years because the Chinese have been doing this for the past 20 years and they will only get better and better at it. If you force the US to come in and expel all the Chinese technocrats, that means the rate of solar development in developing countries is worse for them, as opposed to if they could just have Chinese influence in their countries. But secondly, in terms of cost savings, in in the market for solar energy, China already is making supernormal profits. The US will not for the foreseeable future. So that lack of efficiency in their world means that they won't pay a good price for materials. They will demand higher prices to an extent. And even if they say, we will make sure that the Chinese price is as high as the US price because we tariff the shit out of them, that is still bad for the world because they are paying for higher things in general. So before anything, closing. Then opening. Yeah, it's fine.
Your analysis that tariffs will eventually make everything more expensive only runs till the point other countries, including USA, don't figure out how to make things cheaper. Eventually, when more people compete, you can lower tariffs down to competitive prices. How do you disagree?
Oh, I disagree because in the short term, there is definitely that harm. And if the energy crisis is so bad as you claim, like it's not good to make renewable energy more expensive to adopt for the next 5 to 10 years. But it's just not clear that the US, even with all of the things that they have, are actually able or willing to compete in solar energy for 10 to 20 years to actually match the competitive prices that China has. At the end of this speech, you should buy that the case from government bench is incredibly risky. Maybe 10, 20 years from now, you will have a competitive market where prices are all as low as they are right now. But there is a guarantee, at least on op bench, that China will do all of these good, awesome things in the foreseeable future. It's too risky to fight with economies that are dependent on selling their raw minerals to China, that are dependent upon getting cheap renewable energy now from China. But if you interfere with that process, it might be lost forever. We all know that the willingness to adopt solar energy instead of the US's LNG and shale oil is shockingly limited at times. We're all pragmatic peoples in the developing world. China is the good option for us. Don't take this unnecessary gamble from Gulf.
I thank that speaker for their brilliant remarks and call upon member of government to open up the case for CG. Here.
Hello, just give me a minute and then I'll start. Also, if someone could share the timer, that'd be great.
I am not able to do so. Wendy, could you share a timer, maybe?
I can try. It's because I'm also recording, so I'm not exactly sure how this will.
Maybe I can share screen.
Yeah, but I'm
Maybe I
also
should.
tracking on laptop, so they might be able to see my track, etc.
Yeah, then maybe I should.
Sweet, sweet.
Where have we put the timer at?
Awesome.
Wait.
No, like Google timer or something.
Okay, wait, hold on.
If you go to Google.
I don't have Google.
Okay, then yeah, you do Google Chrome.
Wait. Okay. Okay.
Stopwatch. Yeah.
Wait, how do I? Okay, it's.
Bruh.
Wait, just press OK and open it.
Can you guys see it?
We can see your
I-
screen, but
we
not
can
the clock.
the Clockify dot.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
sharing
one second.
Safari. If you share Chrome, it will.
Oh, okay. Stop
Hold
share.
on. How do I?
I got it.
How do I
You know how to
You
share
do.
this stopwatch, Darin, like the Zoom stopwatch? Because this one would just appear on your screen.
How about this?
Yeah, I can see this
Yeah.
now.
Okay.
That works.
Let's go. Okay.
Let's go.
Thank you so much. Just 30 seconds and then I'll start. Hello everyone. Akshita Kumar going as the member. Preferred pronouns she/her. Preferred mode of taking a POI would be via the chat, preferably after the 5th minute of my speech. Starting my speech on a self counter of 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so the deadlock on the opening half is on America's capability of material and chain supply, which is where we come in and we shift the focus from capacity to the loopholes within China's monopoly to allow USA a better into the global market as to what works, what loopholes in the Chinese industry in the first place allows USA to go ahead and establish that sort of competitiveness which the OG comes and promotes, right? Which then means that firstly, on the entire aspect of what this Chinese industry also looks like, means that while China mass produces cheap panels, the savings don't reach consumers because of a monopolistic control over supply chains, which means that China at all points of time keeps patent control and licensing fees. So the cost reductions don't literally transfer down, right? Which means that at all points of time, it does stay quite expensive and is not something that runs on accessibility. Accessibility still becomes a huge point of contention overall if we look at it, because solar energy is still an elitist and like inaccessible commodity as a whole, right? So even if there are many underdeveloped or developing countries putting in all their resources or labor etc into manufacturing of the solar industry, it is something that is not accessible to them, which means that at all points of time they're not even like directly concerned with consuming them as long as they're in the loop with China in a sort of like producing them. That also at a point in time where it makes them literally extremely vulnerable to all the sorts of fluctuation that can come with the Chinese resolution as such, which then also means that these countries that the OO comes ahead and proves that okay, they'll ultimately have better living conditions for these individuals, or it just sort of works in a way where developing countries or domestic countries are going to be affected, blah blah blah. This also means what we push forward is that the more you get dependent on them, the more vulnerable these countries are, even after at this point of time. Especially if the USA chooses to enter the market, these countries will be vulnerable at a point of time that already face labor standards and worker lack of worker protections as such, which means that there exists Chinese production methods often prioritize like low costs, which are achieved by minimizing wages and operating under labor regulations which are not as precise and which are not as focused on human rights, right? Which means that many developing countries hosting assembly lines are selected precisely because they can offer you that extremely low labor cost at the expense of worker safety and rights, which means that this is where USA can enter into this loophole and then sort of flip that entire prospect because they have like stricter labor and environmental regulations, which means that US based production tends to be subject to more like rigorous labor laws and higher safety standards. So even if production like were to be located in developing countries under US backed supply chains, it will still be at all points of time better than the Chinese supply chains, given the amount of vulnerability that the Chinese industry in itself brings with it, right? Now, what is the problem if the USA doesn't go ahead and align itself with the influence that the Chinese industry, right? After the fifth minute of my speech. Firstly, if the USA relies on China, it risks supply chains and delaying the clean energy shift, right? Which means that at all points of time, at a point in time, you want to go ahead and reinvent solar energy for everyone and want to be that stakeholder. If you go ahead and you give into the influence that the Chinese market has, you're only delaying the clean energy shift, which also allies with what USA can create the entry point into this entire field as such, which means that you focus on environmental concerns, which is exactly what gives USA the entry into the game. If earlier there was like an extensive focus on having like fossil fuels go ahead and govern the USA economy, you can simply shift that to renewable economy, which then also allows other countries, especially EU countries, etc., with the same sort of policies to go ahead and associate with your country. At a point in time, you're allowing like other countries to go ahead and associate with yourself. You're also creating this sort of standard for everyone and for your own market that actually develops in a manner that attracts more allies towards your industry as a whole. What it does is that it creates USA to be the global leader of solar leadership, right? Which then also helps in whatever sort of market that they'll be creating. On points of capacity, at points of capacity, US at all points of time is able to go ahead and compete and build a standard that is what the OO claims similar to China and will never be. But that is extremely easily done on the USA side, given that they simply have more, they have the infrastructural and economic resources to go ahead and do that, which then means that they, at a point in time, they'll be able to govern the alliances of the solar panel market as a whole. It'll put them to an area where their own domestic as well as international market successions are something that are going to flourish, which then also means that it'll help them focus on accessibility as a whole. Now, accessibility as a whole is an important contention here because we promote like largely three things, right? We promote the dependency on China makes the US vulnerable to like trade wars and sanctions and creates legal vulnerabilities, as well as which means that China could then at any point of time restrict the export that there is to come, right? Which means that it then poses USA at like legal vulnerabilities and trade dependencies, because the entire legal argument is about the dependence on Chinese solar production that exposes the USA to significant legal risks. China's dominance in the solar market as a whole has like lots of patents and proprietary manufacturing techniques, right? Now, this legal monopoly also stifles like competition, but then also creates a dependency that leaves everyone vulnerable in the end in the entire arena of international trade disputes, which is where we come in and we express the need for USA to come forward and be the global leader for not only our own domestic capabilities, but then also the entire geopolitics that is concerned with this entire global solar leadership, right? Because then we also promote ethical labor and import regulations along with stricter environmental regulations, which is something that is extremely important in a field where developing countries are not getting access to the solar markets in the first place. And this new competition could then go ahead and lead to a lower market prices, which will then eventually help developing countries also opt in into this entire process of solar market leadership instead of just being manufacturing areas, right? Which then also means that at a point in time, you have more allies to go ahead and support you, then your market also flourishes, because then people go ahead and support your products over, let's say, the monopoly of Chinese products, which are not environmentally good, ethically good, as well as like overall due to their instability. With that, CJ.
I thank the member of government for that fine speech and call upon member of opposition. I of course encourage all speakers to try their best to take a POI, as they are an important part of engagement. Without further ado, CEO, whenever you're ready.
I just want to check if I'm audible and like clear.
Crystal clear.
All right, just give me a few seconds and I'll get started. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If Gulf Ventures' claim is that they get an optical benefit over being able to leverage over China by trying to A, either break this Chinese monopoly, or B, create some level of security to the point in which they establish their own US market, we're going to contend on this in CEO in a few ways, and the burden we're simply going to prove to you is why the aggressive pursuit in the short term is one that's counterproductive to the US, because at best, it is a zero-sum game, because we don't necessarily see how this aligns with what the US is trying to do, and why there's inherently better outlets in order to access the Gulf bench benefit of displacing Chinese monopolies in other industries. How do we then distinguish from OO here? OO is just going to tell you essentially why this is something that's inherently bad in the general scope of the debate and why developing countries suffer. First of all, we're going to just directly tell you off the bat that there's a lack of mechanization to explain why necessarily the extent of which a US investment into this industry, irrespective of their like protectionist policies and aggressive forms of tariffing, is going to instantly deter an industry that's 80% of a monopoly, and why that's somehow going to trickle down into developing countries, and now everybody's going to suffer or either have to comply to the US. On our side, we're going to tell you why both if in the best case, both like worlds will exist, but why this is just a zero-sum game for the US and something they're better off just not doing in that of itself. First point of contention in this debate. I don't understand why so far on GovBench there's this huge issue as to how China produces its labor through like exploitation is sound like a bad issue. First of all, even if China was exploitative as hell, the fact that they did it and still got an 80% monopoly over the industry is still a net gain in this debate. It doesn't necessarily change the reliability of them as a whole in terms of their ability to output solar panels as a whole. But secondarily, the whole clash on access to distributors, right? First of all, note that China already has a monopoly over the ability to access these resources in the first place, which means that even if the fact that perhaps countries like Africa, like the Congo, even if they were to sell, because it's a very much so a cost-invested game where distributors sell to those who are willing to pay the highest price, the fact that the USA has to make a much larger initial investment in order to breach into this industry is one that's likely to limit their capacity to even buy these things or outdo pre-existing deals that China already has with Africa. But first of all, first question in this speech, what is the USA even looking to do on a political and financial level? Note, sure, they do want to generally break Chinese monopolies and establish themselves as a forefront within the global economy and like the global powerhouse, like as a superpower. But secondarily, they generally want to make more profit, like incentivizing decisions, right? This is the nature of how Trump has always operated throughout his campaigns and like throughout his like tenures. But the problem is, irrespective of the fact that Trump wants to make money, it does the point of being a profitable like industry is not something that overrides necessarily the ability or the desire to then overthrow Chinese monopolies. This means that insofar as a decision is not financially productive for the USA, it doesn't particularly matter to them if they're able to break a Chinese monopoly, insofar as like this is something that's bad, right? But second question I'm going to answer, which is what then would the USA have to do to break into these industries, and how are China likely to respond? Here's where I want to contend on the feasibility of the USA being able to tap outside of their local markets, right? Because first of all, understand the way in which the solar market develops right now within the US. There are levels of development, there are levels of purchasing from countries like China and the other 20%. But the point here is that GovBench needs to justify an aggressive pursuit of this, a larger allocation of resources into this at the expense of other places. The point here is because China have patented ways of producing certain things and significantly larger ways to access certain resources, this means that even in the best case where the USA expends a large amount of resources, they're likely to still face a lot of backlash from China in terms of how they're going to respond to this because of the asymmetries that exist. This means that the second China feels like one of their most biggest monopolized industries is to any extent under threat by the USA, they're just going to further develop because they have the capacity to preempt any form of movement by the US, because any form of development by the US is still likely to take a reasonable amount of period of time, which means the likelihood of the US dislodging this monopoly is something that's already largely mitigated. This largely undercuts a lot of the benefits that the like GovBench want to talk about, right? Which is like, oh, we get like independent things, because I'm proving to you that it's already financially counterproductive, but B, even your smallest benefit, which is to get some level of optical or political leverage over China, is something that we're undercutting, because this is just an unwise investment, because you cannot prove the feasibility of the USA being able to necessarily compete with China, who already have a chokehold on general countries because of the agreement and different countries as well. But there's questions in this speech, which is why there are other more lower hanging outlets to establish monopolies or like break Chinese monopolies, or even just to assert USA dominance. No, there's so many other industries that the US is better off pumping this money into and just allowing a natural development of their solar sectors. This looks like industries like oil, for example, irrespective of it being a declining field, things like the Petro-Saudi agreement that the USA has with Saudi Arabia, or all chokeholds that the USA has over industries. This means other places, like perhaps prioritizing trade in dollar, actively challenging organizations like BRICS, who are actively trying to de-dollarize, are still better forms of investments for the US, because they're more tangible and more feasible for them to actually enact any change, but two, they significantly have lower barriers of entry in order for them to even make these forms of change. We tell you these are better ways in which, or alternatives that the US can still gain that optical or political benefit that they want to get, without having to dwell or aggressively pump money into this industry in order to get that benefit. But the next question then, why if the USA, I'll take you in a bit, why even if the USA is able to establish this industry to its fullest, irrespective of the counterproductive cost, trade still becomes hard because one, China has the extent of market collections. Sure, GovBench tell you that there's an incentive for European countries to want to trade with the US because they oftentimes view the US as a more reliable actor as opposed to China. Even if this were true, status quo actively proves otherwise because of the nature of policies that Trump wants to pass. One, One, note that Trump recently threatened to tariff most European countries. There's been withdrawal from NATO, threatens to withdraw from NATO and reduce funding to NATO. These are all active threats against Trump's willingness to rely on European countries as a whole, who already have pre-existing deals with like China, right? This means that one, European countries who already probably have traded with China over periods of time to large success and have already successfully developed their industries are probably uninclined to change this against someone who's relatively protectionist and relatively not likely to support you in that of itself, right? This proves a few things. This proves that even if the US are able to establish their own individual industry, the likelihood of them being able to facilitate that in a way that's able to compete against China is one that's also largely limited. But why can solar development still happen for the US in our world? One, we tell you can still do things like independent trade with China if they want, or even tap into the other 20% of the industry. Why is this still better for the US? One, they're still able to develop their solar industry because one, it's still going to be comparatively cheaper to do these things because of the fact that they don't need to create refinery refinery factories and etc. But they can still tap into these forms of like development for their solar industry without having to directly compete with China. But two, it also just shows that there's still progressive levels of development, even though it's slow on our side, and even though the fact that perhaps they don't have their own solar industry, we tell you that the point in which this industry still develops and is significantly not a priority for the US right now is something that's still beneficial. Three impacts we give you. It's a counterproductive mechanism from the US to want to aggressively do this. We tell you the national alignment and status quo is better, but secondly, the industry can still grow, and we still think the money is better off invested in other places to get that political benefit that they want to talk about. For all those reasons, CO.
I thank member of opposition for that fine speech and call upon government whip. Hear, hear.
Hello again. We'll start in a minute.
Gov whip, are you ready?
Hello. Yes, yes. Okay. Just 10 seconds.
Sure.
Okay. Starting my speech on a self count of 3, 2, 1, go. The main factor over here is that in regards to like developing countries or underdeveloped countries, the thing is that they don't really have an option since no other industry is going ahead and pursuing pursuing the creation of a solar industry in and of in itself aggressively, right? Which means that they're forced to comply with the Chinese industries, with the standards of Chinese industries, and with whatever they're going forward and demanding out of these countries, right? At a point in time, they do not have the availability of option, then they are forced to comply, which means that Chinese monopoly also exists because it is the only industry that is right now aggressively going forward and participating in this in the creation of, let's say, a solar panel leadership, being like the then going ahead and creating some sort of monopoly for the same, right? Which then means that at a point in time, USA comes ahead and pursues the domestic production of solar energy panels at a domestic level. Then it is in and of in itself financially productive for this country, which is exactly counter to what this CO comes ahead and says, right? Because USA at all points of time is looking for methods and ways to go ahead and develop their economy, right? And domestic solar production will be inevitably financially productive for the USA. Firstly, because of course it goes ahead and creates like a scope for massive job creation and industrial growth, right? Which means at a point in time you're building a domestic solar industry. It means you're investing more into manufacturing, R&D, installation, maintenance jobs, service jobs, etc., etc. And USA already has the economic input to go ahead and do that, which also means that at a point in time you are expecting you are saying that, oh, it'll be like tons of investment. We say that investment argument is very valid because that is leading to more outward investment to come into the USA economy in and of in itself, which means that in a short term, sure, it'll be expensive for the USA to go ahead and invest that heavily into the industry as a whole, but in a long term, they will gain the financial stability in this entire area, right? Because then they're going to go ahead and develop into it. It doesn't stop with just investing once and like, okay, not progressing further. Given that it's USA, it's potentially possible that we are having like new service workers come in and manufacture and develop and progress the research way of it, which means that it's going to develop, it's going to be innovative, there's going to be a lot of innovation creation, and ultimately it'll prove to be beneficial for the USA given the amount of resources that it has, both in terms of human resources, both in terms of technological resources, legal stability, and whatever intellectual resources that it has, right? Which then also means that at a point in time, USA goes ahead and invests in this entire thing. It is saving and strengthening, it is like saving billions of money, right? Because then domestic production eliminates import costs, tariffs, and supply chain vulnerabilities that there exist, which means that it ensures kind of that more money stays in the US economy, because now you're going domestic, you're creating things, you're like supplying it in a way that is domestically productive because
Closing.
you're handling each and everything after the 5th minute of speech for sure, right? Which then also means that a US based solar industry will shield the country over and of itself from price fluctuations in the global supply chain as a whole, because now it is aggressively funding towards the investment into the solar energy. That means that it gets to also sort of decide the sort of accessibility and the prices that it wants to set, right? Which is only going to be the best in the long run, given that it knows that it is competing with China. So it knows that there are stakes on the line and what sort of countries are going to opt into the USA's entire solar energy market, right? Which then means that it gives USA more scope to go ahead and develop it in the way it wants to, doesn't comply with whatever China wants to do, simply because they're not dependent on only Chinese monopoly. The option, that the creation of an option that exists, gives both USA to fund more or to like get more money from their economy, and then also allow other countries to go ahead and explore options, which is an extremely important point at in a point of time we are talking about global market, right? Which leads to that there is more private investment, there is more boosting of the GDP, and USA's entire economy as a whole flourishes, right? Which then entirely puts the CEO's argument of it not being financially productive for US at like a low at like not a very accurate level, given that there are literally so many options of them dividing and putting down the energy costs for businesses and households, and then making it in a localized efforts, because once it starts at the top, it is going to trickle down into smaller industries that are they'll want to go ahead and pioneer in this field. So it's going to lead to a grassroots movement where more people are opting into it, simply because they now see that okay, it is more financially providing for the US economy, so they want to be a part of that, right? So then what do we do? OG comes here and they talk about all the economic benefits that they could potentially get, but they still do not go ahead and like make it in a way that we can totally land
Closing.
at the impact, which is yes, sure, pure.
Your main push is about financially productive. If your aim is to be financially productive, basically you have to charge higher in order to achieve your outcome. Therefore, you are pushing a higher burden on the citizens, which is not fair.
Right. The entire thing is that this market thing is a competition, right? They know that they're competing. Sure, the initial investment is going to be slightly heavy, but in the longer run, if USA is going to want a sustainable market, it is going to keep all sorts of prices in mind, right? It is going to look at whatever sort of prices, then they can get the they can go ahead and compete in the market with China without like going ahead and being like starkly heavily priced, because of course that's not going to gain them any sort of input in the market if they want to go ahead and establish themselves in the first place, which means that USA is logically sane enough to go ahead and consider that as a fact. So I don't understand the entire relevance of your POI, but again, as we go ahead and we prove what sort of ethicality and legal instability that is there related with China, and the sort of environmental problems and HR violations that exist on China's paradigm, which does not make it a very soluble industry to go ahead and look forward to, do, given that you're talking about monopoly. The more you allow it, the more these legal instability, environmental regulations are going to bite you in the ass, right? And then on to OO's entire point about better living conditions for these individuals, blah, blah, blah. I simply don't think that's possible on their side of the paradigm, given that there are factual proofs and fallacies as to how the Chinese markets operate, right? On to CO, their entire point of it not being financially productive for the US is something I already go ahead and explain. For these reasons, vote CG.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks and call upon opposition whip to close up the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, just give me a quick second. Yanju, he, him pronounce. Send my speech in 3, 2, 1. A couple of direct response towards case coming from opening government. What is their main push? They tell us a couple of things. First thing, they tell us that US have the capability to do so. They tell us that there's a domestic house in the New Jersey area. They are basically solarized, and California have the technology to fit the current needs of the society. Then, but we tell you that although this is workable, but there's a clarifications coming from CO in Praveen's speech that we actively told you that although this is workable and it makes sense under the current US situations, but we tell you that this is not the primary task. This is not the primary task coming from the current Trump government. Therefore, it shouldn't be active. We shouldn't be actively pursue for the development of domestic solar sectors, because you're gonna throw all your funding and also your money into this field, but not getting positive return in the short time. Then I think Praveen have really prove it and explain it quite well to you. I don't think that I have to explain a lot in my speech then. It basically tells us that it's expand the job opportunity, which that you're going to get engineers, you're going to involve different people, class of society into it. This basically give benefit to every level of society, right? We did the first thing, expensive labor, the cost transfer to consumers, which makes the consumers and the citizens itself have to pay a higher price in order to get the solar panel that produced by United States locally. We know this is inherently bad. And even though if you want to argue that you want to produce the job opportunities, we tell you that this is not true, because this is the wrong kind of job. First thing then, the United States cannot compete with China cheap labor and efficient mass production. If they are forced to manufacture solar panel domestically, companies will automate heavily, which basically reducing the actual job creation. But the second thing is, there's a better job opportunity elsewhere. It looks like you're going to have, instead of having the low solar margin, the margin solar panel manufacturing, the US are able to opt into different high-tech green energy jobs. Like for example, they should have their battery R&D, the AI-driven energy management system that are basically will produce a greater revenue and also job opportunities to the society, which this actually fit the characterizations of the United States when they're actually a strong nation of technological advancement then. And then this is a better opportunity and also a better pathway that the United States can actually pursue for. But the third thing is, the consumer will basically pay higher prices for it. It's because that the United States made solar panel be far more expensive than the imported one. And they probably have already proved it to you, and also the opening opposition have already proved it to you. But this basically slow down the solar adaptations are harming consumers. What's the example then? The illustration here is simple. The Trump era of solar tariff raised price panel in the United States, leading to job losses in the 2018 in solar installations sector because the higher cost reduced demand. I'll be further explain why the cost will increase in the response towards closing opposition later then. But the third thing is, they basically contribute and tell us that they will make Chinese product expensive so you don't lose Chinese market, right? But it's clear that the trade relationship between China and the United States are already in a very vulnerable stage. When you push for domestic solar aggressive basically trigger the Chinese economy retaliations. This basically hurts other industries when United States heavily rely on made in China products, because these products are usually often comes in a very cheap prices, and even the citizens need it a lot. If you increase the price significantly and you impose tariff towards all these products and to make it expensive, who will be the one who suffer? The people who will suffer is basically your citizens, because they are forced to buy your products at a more expensive price, which means that it will cause a political backlash towards the current government, because they feel their obligations to protect the current economical system in the United States then. But what's the thing that they respond to us? They respond that this cannot weigh over the instability. But the direct response here is simple, because one, they tell us that China will cause instability on because that they will distribute product to only their allies. But we talk on two direct response. One, United States don't rely on their products to get allies. They get support and also from developing countries and other countries because of the military contributions of the United States. This looks like they actively participate in NATO. Therefore, they get a lot of allies like Ukraine and also like EU countries from NATO. Them. But the second thing is, it is not even the US primary goal and also task for US when they are not urgent, when they are not even urgent on this specific matter. OG then have to prove the urgency on this matter, therefore they can claim all the benefits that you declare in today's debate. Why we win over OG? The reason here is simple. Because they don't prove urgency. Why then we have to do that? Praveen already proved to you that why this is not important in the status quo. If they want to talk about stability, United States don't rely on solar energy purely right now. If they want to talk about job opportunity, they can get it from a more efficient field like AI, etc., etc. They fail in today's debate. But second thing that I want to deal in the second house I want to deal with is opening oppositions. How are we going to distinguish ourselves from opening opposition? The first thing is they're being very uncharitable in today's debate. What do you mean then? Because they fail to engage with the best case scenario when they fail to engage in the worst case scenario when United States actually have the resources and also raw material and technological advancement, etc., etc. I think that Praveen already explained how we're going to come into the debate and solve this issue. I think that Praveen already explained to you that what this is not the primary task for United States. What they should focus on, three things. They should focus on things looks like climate change and environment sustainability, the UN SDG goals, and also like they get a recent case like the Los Angeles deforestation and also fire. The second thing is they face an issue on economical inequality and wage stagnations. If they have all these issues, I'm unsure that how their citizens have the capability to buy their products then. But the third thing is they have the current immigration reform, which is more pivotal and more important in today's world, which make them have to shift. If this is the case coming from opening government, which means that they have to shift all the monies and the resources towards a new industries that might risk them for not making for not getting a huge amount of profit from it. This is not worth it. But the third house I want to deal in today's debate is scolding government. What they contribute to today's debate. First thing, they tell us about there's a dependent on China, which because there is a labor operations in their country. United States can have stricter regulations on labor law. We know that this is not factually untrue, and this is not important. Why? Because to enforce the regulations, the increase of funds is needed. The cost will basically transfer back to the consumer, and basically the people have to pay for a higher price in order to get the product. I don't see why that you have to come into the market, the United States have to come into the market just because that the labor operations in China, but your people will suffer economically because the people on your ground, your middle working class people are unable to purchase your solar panel. Then what's the purpose for you to produce and also have your own domestic R&D of solar panel then? But the second thing is, they tell you that they want to make the United States a strategic technological leadership in the center. But the first thing is, the purpose of the solar panel is only domestic use. But then the technological leadership is about research and not manufacturing. The second thing is about that the collaboration is better than isolations, right? They can actively collaborate with allies like the EU and also Japan and also South Korea. Why we win today's debate? First thing, we are the only house who identify that this is not there's no urgency for United States to do so, and they should shift their focus to the more important thing. But the second thing we want to explain in today's debate that we want to tell you that this doesn't harm any of the country because the material are distributed by the raw material distributor. But the third thing then is we're able to explain to you that how people are going to suffer, how the government going to get political backlash from the people then, and this is uncharitable, this is not good. We grounded the impact for you that people actually suffer. With all these reasons, go to CO, sorry.
I thank opposition whip for wrapping up the debate as a whole. I believe that there is a different breakout room